Before I introduce our speaker tonight, I just have just a couple comments here. First of all, I want to thank all you that supported the Hershey Civil War Roundtable this past year and also supported me in the speakers that I brought here this past year. And I hope that everybody got something out and enjoyed the speakers that we had. I want to make two comments on two Zoom programs for next year. I really would encourage you to check these out. The first one is Julian Scher. He lives in Montreal, Canada. When I made contact with him, I'd seen this program, and it's called "The Canada's Role in the Civil War." They were very sympathetic to the Confederacy, and they raised over $1 million that they donated to the Confederate States of America to keep the war going, and so forth. But then the next one is Jack Hinson. Bob O'Brien will be speaking. I think he lives in Connecticut. Jack Hinson is supposed to be the first real American sniper. And I want to just give you a little touch of what this program is about. Jack Hinson was 57 years old. He lived on a plantation that was 1,200 acres. And he had over 100 slaves. But he was against succession, and he lived, and the plantation was near Fort Donelson. Everybody knows where Fort Donelson is, and so forth. What happened was he had 10 children, 8 sons and 2 daughters, and his oldest son, who was 18, and a 15-year-old son went hunting. They got picked up by a Union patrol. And the Union Patrol said, "You guys are bushwhackers." They executed both of the sons, dragged their bodies through the town of Dover behind the horses, and then decapitated their heads and put them in burlap bags and stuck them on the fence post of the plantation. Jack Hinson decided, "I'm going to need revenge." He gets a special made 50 caliber rifle with German sights on it and goes out, and it is recorded that he had over 100 kills, 36 notches on his rifle, and those notches were for every officer of the Union Army. And the first 2 people that he killed were the 2 individuals that executed his son. He was on Grant's most wanted list, and they hunted for him and hunted for him. They never caught him, and so forth. So that is really a shocking thing. I just got the book this past Saturday on him, and it's very intriguing. So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker, Mary Turk-Meena. Give you a little background on her. She's a retired attorney. She practiced law for 35 years, and in 2016, she decided she wanted to be a licensed battlefield guide at Gettysburg. She is one of only 15 female guides out of the 130 plus guides that are at Gettysburg. She also mentored several people, men and women, who were wanting to go through the process of wanting to take the test to be battlefield guides. She received her undergraduate degree in music, and then she got her law degree from Temple University. When are you leaving? Tomorrow, Monday. Back to North Carolina. When are you going back to North Carolina? Monday. When she's done it, when she's not at Gettysburg, she finally goes back home to Charlotte, North Carolina, for her husband. And she has 2 daughters, one that lives in London and the other that lives in Charlotte. So without further ado, I'd like for us to give Mary a nice warm Hershey Civil War welcome. Yeah.
I'm going to make sure that this works. Everybody can hear me okay? Yes.
All right. My only question, Tom, is did he shoot John Reynolds?
What's that?
Did he shoot John Reynolds? There are about 10 people that like to take credit for that. All right, and I'm gonna work with this a little bit, and see how this works. But first of all, it's a pleasure to be here. And Tom asked me to just spend a couple of minutes on the licensing process to become a guide at Gettysburg. It's not something for the faint of heart, to be sure. And some of you may be familiar with it, but just a very quick description, it's a 4-part process that's changed over the last few years. We're being told that there's likely to be a written test again next December, likely next December. So start studying now. And it's, at least it has been, it may be changed, we don't know. But in the past, it's been an all-day written exam with about 360 fill-in-the-blank questions in the morning and 8 essays in the afternoon. It covers pre-war, the entire Civil War, Gettysburg in detail, Reconstruction, and beyond. So it's a lot of material, and they test it in different ways. So if you get through that, then you do a panel interview. If you make it through that, then you do a practicum on the battlefield, and all that knowledge you've learned to be able to pass the written test. Point of the practicum on the battlefield is stand here and in 5 minutes, tell us what happened. You've got to be able to take all that knowledge, toss it out, and get to the essential pieces of it, which is what you'll use in most tours you do on the battlefield. And then the last part is a 2-hour car tour of the battlefield that you do for the supervising park ranger and a senior licensed battlefield guide.
Wow.
The year I went through in 2016, 150 people started the process. Taking the written exam, 13 got licensed.
Oh.
And that's pretty typical. Usually less than 10% make it through. They start the process without any concept of how many guides they want. They take those that they think qualify. So we'll do it again. We'll see how different it is now. I'm on the other side of it, and I get to mentor people. I get to, at least in 2018, write the test questions, sit on the panel interviews, do the testing for the car tours. Whole lot more fun than going through the process. So anything else you want me to add? You just want to know, let people know how hard this is. It is pretty crazy, but boy, is it worth it. It is an absolute privilege to be able to, first of all, take people around the battlefield, honor these soldiers, both sides that did their duty as they saw it at that time. And to do things like this, which gives us a chance to do some extra research on people like George Meade, that many people have kind of a surface understanding of, but don't really get to delve down into it. So we're going to do that tonight. And we're going to start with 3 opinions of George Meade. The first is Meade lacked dash. I'm going to turn this up. That is high as
I think as high as it goes, yeah.
this will be fun. Meade lacked dash, charisma, and the ability to inspire men through the projection of a heroic image. Another opinion, a dull but very capable officer. One last opinion, he is not a man who inspires enthusiasm, for he is cold, unbending, and not given to granting indulgences. But in time of peril, they lean on him as on a strong wall, and they now feel more than before that when he orders an attack, there is a plan and an object to be gained, and that without such a plan and such an object, he will save the men, no matter what disappointment to himself. So that's a much better opinion of George Meade. So there are lots of diverging opinions, as we can see, about George Meade. A lot of this comes down through history. What we're going to do is look at the man, look at what motivates this man, and talk about some of those controversies that have come around about George Meade, and what starts some of those controversies. You know what, this is not gonna work. I don't know how long we can do this. But it's, I don't know how to work either. All right, so let's talk about what are those specific criticisms of George Meade. Well, we know some of them are pretty well known. He was timid and didn't want to fight guys. The Pipe Creek Circular, that we'll talk about a little bit, has been viewed as a retreat order. Think about that for a minute. He fails to counterattack following the retreat of Pickett's charge, the repulsive Pickett's charge. He's overly cautious in pursuing Lee once he begins to retreat, and he uses a council of war on the nights of July the 2nd, July the 4th, and July the 12th, which seems to indicate a lack of strength in George Meade. So behind that cold exterior that was mentioned before, George Meade is a man who is highly ambitious, but humble. He cares deeply about his reputation, as we'll see, has a strong sense of duty to his country, is very sensitive about what other people think about it. And probably the most famous thing we know about George Meade, he lashes out when he believes he's been wrong. So we'll talk about all of those things, but first let's look at the man. Here's George Meade. Born in December 31st of 1815, of course, famously in Cadiz, Spain. He's the 9th child in his family. His grandfather was a merchant and revolutionary patriot in Philadelphia. His father's occupation is an international merchant, which is what takes him to Spain. But his father is going to end up ruined by the Napoleonic Wars. Family returns to Philadelphia, but without the father, who's imprisoned in Spain. It's not until the settlement of the First Seminole Indian War against Spanish Florida that George's father will be released and allowed to return back to the United States. Meade's father dies in 1828 when George is 12 years old. But he's already developing a reputation. A teacher of young George Meade says he possesses an uncommon quickness of perception and is therefore capable of acquiring knowledge with great rapidity. General deportment is worthy of high commendation. George's mother requests 3 separate times for George to be appointed to West Point. While the family has some political influence, they have no money. And so West Point is the best free education George can get. From all accounts, he has absolutely no interest in a military career. On this slide, okay. So he'll attend West Point, and he is 17th, right? 17th, 19th in a class, and marries on his 25th birthday. Margaretta Sargent Meade of Philadelphia. She is well connected, but just like many others during the Civil War, George Meade, a Northerner, has some Southern connections. He has a sister. We're going to run to her, Elizabeth Meade Ingraham. He has a sister who is married. She's married to a Philadelphian, but a Philadelphian who works for a bank. And they are sent down to Mississippi to take care of the bank's financial interests in plantation land, southern and Mississippi River. Mississippi, she'll write eventually a fairly short diary that covers the time when Grant's army is coming through Mississippi on its way to Vicksburg. And her plantation, she and her husband's plantation, will be used by some of Grant's soldiers. As a headquarters, she is an ardent secessionist. By the time they get there, slave owner. So that's one sister of George Meade's. He has another sister who was married to a Confederate Navy officer. So there's some ties there, and there are some letters back and forth. Meade will try and do some things to help his sisters out after the war. In addition, his wife's sister is married to, before the Civil War, the governor of Virginia. So more ties. His wife, Margaretta, is well connected politically. We've got a photograph. That's about the only photograph I found of Margaretta Meade. She is an incredibly important person in George Meade's life. They will get married again December 31st on his birthday in 1840. She is well connected. Her father was Henry Clay's running mate in 1832, in the presidential election of 1832. They meet in Washington. Her father's not very excited about George Meade, isn't in favor of the marriage, but is finally won over. She is quite the society woman back then. She's fluent in 3 or 4 languages. By the way, Meade is fluent in French and plays the piano well. They will have 7 children. 7 children. What does that say? 1841 and 1855. So 7 children. One of them, of course, will be an aide to George Meade here at Gettysburg. Meade has one confidant in the entire world, and that's his wife. He writes voluminously to his wife, telling her lots of things that he will never tell anyone else. He doesn't get involved in the politicking in the Army of the Potomac. He doesn't maneuver himself into positions. He does his duty, and this shows up in the letters. But as we'll see, there are lots of those little confidential things in the letters as well. But generally, he does not play politics. He will, even to the point of telling his wife in one of the letters, go get a map of Virginia so you can see where we are and what we're doing. So very interesting relationship. Meade has also, and somebody at dinner said, gosh, why did he die so young? Well, let's talk about George Meade's medical history. At West Point, and these medical histories are fascinating. At West Point, he was being treated for a headache 6 times, for a cold 3 times, treated once each for a sore throat, sore hand, boil, fever, rheumatism, nausea, influenza, a wound of no further description, and vomiting. So he's either a hypochondriac or he's very frail. You pick. Impossible to tell. When he graduates from West Point, he's in that portion of the class that will become artillery officers. And he will become, keep pushing the wrong thing, an artillery officer for 1 year. That's his required service. And he will spend that time in Florida during a Seminole Indian War, but he becomes sick in the heat. And so a change in climate is recommended. At his change of climate is in June of 1836. He'll be part of an escort party taking 400 Seminole Indians to Indian Territory in Oklahoma. And he seems to be able to recover from that. By 1836, now he resigns from the U.S. Army, again, not remotely interested in any kind of military career, and is now, excuse me, a topographical engineer in the private sector. Topographical engineers during this time are essentially government contractors. And so George Meade will be involved in some boundary disputes. He'll survey in the Northeast. He'll survey in Florida. He'll do some work in the Mississippi River Delta. He's building lighthouses in Florida, looking for navigable ports in the Great Lakes. He's doing a lot of work around the country. This is the beginning of our Army Corps of Engineers, and they're outsourcing a bunch of it. But by 1842, Meade returns to the Army because the US Congress disallows the use of civilian contractors. So if he wants to keep doing the work he's doing, he's got to go back in the Army, which, by the way, happens to give him a regular paycheck as his family is growing. So now, as a US topographical engineer, he'll be assigned to a survey project in Texas, and by the time it's finished, in 1845, now he has jaundice. 1846 to 1847, he's a staff officer on Zachary Taylor's staff, a topographical engineer for Zachary Taylor in Mexico, and he gets sick again. His recuperation takes some time, and this is George Meade's very first experience with volunteer troops. Just like during the Civil War, the Mexican War, these armies are made up of volunteer troops, and he has an opinion about these volunteer troops. He'll say he notes that they are very undisciplined and do not expect to perform regular Army tasks, and they drink heavily. That's his opinion. By 1859, he's back in Florida in another Seminole uprising, and a fort will be named for George Meade down in Florida, as we did then. So that brings us close to the 1860 election. Who knows who Meade votes for? Anybody? Nope. He votes for John Bell of the Constitution Party. This is the platform of the Constitution Union Party. The Union as it is, and the Constitution as it is. This is a party that wants to avoid secession by avoiding any discussion of slavery. Okay, that's his politics, and again, he will keep that very close to the vest. But it is clear that that's who he votes for in 1860. At the outbreak of the Civil War, he's in Detroit. He's in charge of a geodetic survey of the Great Lakes, looking for navigable ports, plumbing for depths of the Great Lakes. And it turns out to be some pretty amazing stuff that George Meade does there. But while he's there, right after Fort Sumter surrenders, there's an influential Michigan politician by the name of Zachariah Chandler, who will decide that up in Michigan, now that we've had a lot of US Army officers resign from the US Army to join the Confederate States and the Confederate States Army, he wants to make sure all the US Army officers up in Detroit are loyal. And so he decides there's going to be a big ceremony in Detroit where all these US Army officers will again take their oath of loyalty to the United States. All but 3 show up for that ceremony. One of the 3 that doesn't is George Meade. George Meade believes that it is inappropriate for a civil official to require the loyalty of a US Army officer. His loyalty is to the US Army. What that does, however, is put him sideways with Zachariah Chandler. Zachariah Chandler, not too long from now, by December of 1861, sits on the Congressional Committee on the Conduct of the War, investigative committee. Yeah. He is one of the 2 radicals that really run that committee, and he's got a long memory. So Meade is going to start to make some enemies here, but look at the reasoning for it. For him, it's a thoughtful response. It's not anything against Zachariah Chandler. It's against the process that Chandler wants them to undertake. He will not be involved at First Manassas or First Bull Run. He is up in Pennsylvania or up in Michigan. His wife is trying to push him to get a commission. He'll be offered command of a Michigan regiment, which he turns down because he wants to be a topographical engineer on McClellan's staff. Eventually, he will get a commission as a major general of volunteers from and be put in charge of Pennsylvania troops, Pennsylvania Reserve troops. He will also, right after Manassas, for one of the very few times he ever does it, express an opinion about what happened at Manassas. He's well aware of what happens, and he says this shameful disaster resulted entirely from our army not being efficiently officered and organized. An army is like a complicated machine. All its parts must know and do their work, or you will inevitably have confusion and disaster. He has just described First Manassas. So he'll get his commission. He gets to Washington just in time to purchase his uniform, because all the officers buy their own uniforms, and his favorite horse, Old Baldy. And I did not put Old Baldy in the slideshow. I should have. Old Baldy is his favorite horse, and by what happens to Old Baldy, we know where George Meade is on the battlefield. Old Baldy will be wounded multiple times, including left for dead on the Antietam battlefield. When they go back and clean up the battlefield, they find Old Baldy grazing away. And George Meade gets him back. He'll be wounded both at Gettysburg and then later at Petersburg, and then retired by George Meade. But even as he writes home in the rest of 1864, 1865, he wants to know how Old Baldy is. So he's pleased that that takes, Old Baldy does well. So he will be in the Pennsylvania Reserves. And he is a brigade commander, just like John Reynolds. They're both brigade commanders of the Pennsylvania Reserves, and Edward O.C. Moore is the other brigade commander. Three pretty darn competent generals coming out of the Pennsylvania Reserves. He'll spend some time in court-martial duty, and eventually meet Abraham Lincoln, apparently for the first time, in a dress parade of Meade's troops. And at that time, Meade will compliment Lincoln on his rescission of General David Hunter's emancipation order that Hunter gave in May of 1862 to emancipate slaves in Florida, Georgia, and South Carolina. Lincoln rescinds that, much like he rescinds Fremont's earlier order in Missouri. And Meade's going to compliment him on rescinding that order. This is not what this war is about. 7 days battle. George Meade will be seriously wounded at Glendale. He'll write to his wife. He has 2 wounds. He'll write to his wife, "My wounds are not dangerous, though they require immediate and constant attention." Go ahead and put those 2 phrases together. "I am to leave in the first boat for Old Point and from thence home." So he'll spend some time recuperating at home. The serious wound is a bullet that enters his upper right side, goes diagonally down his torso, misses the spine by about an inch, nicks his lung, and then exits. And it's a wound that will continue to trouble him the rest of the war. But he's going to tell us way through that. So while Meade recuperates, there's some changes in the Pennsylvania Reserve Division that will move John Reynolds to command of the division. Meade rejoins his brigade August of 1862 and writes to his wife, "My brigade all seemed right glad to see you, both officers and men, and I do believe they were sincere." This begins, and we'll see it over and over again, George Meade taking in those compliments. They're very important to him, and he cherishes those compliments. Antietam. At that point, we know what happens to Reynolds at Antietam, right? He's not there. He's up in Pennsylvania, helping to put the Pennsylvania militia, emergency militia together. And Meade will be placed in command of the 3rd Division of Hooker's now 1st Corps. And when Hooker is wounded at Antietam, Hooker will personally put Meade in command of the 1st Corps. Meade objects, because he is not the senior division commander. So what Meade does is go to the senior commander, who's a guy by the name of Ricketts, not the artillerist, and then goes off to say that I don't belong in charge of this corps because there's a guy senior to me. And there will be 2 notes written from McClellan during the fighting at Antietam that makes it clear Meade is to be in command of that first corps. He'll write to his wife, October 29th of 1863, when Reynolds returns. Frankness compels me to say that I do wish Reynolds had stayed away, and that I could have had a chance to command a corps in action. Those two messages that McClellan writes during Antietam that make it clear that Meade is to be in command of the first corps, even though he's not the senior division commander. Meade will send those to his wife for safekeeping, because they recognize his competence on the battlefield. So a lot of this stuff that Meade gets, that he wants to make sure gets saved, he sends to his wife. So a little bit of a sense of the pride of this man and his ambition. He'll also write to his wife October 12th. At this point, he's had a lot of exposure to Joseph Hooker. And he'll write to her and say, Hooker and I are old acquaintances. Hooker is a Democrat and anti-abolitionist. That is to say, he was. What he will be when the command of the army is held out to him is more than anyone can tell, because I fear he is open to temptation and liable to be seduced by flattery. He will also write to his wife November 22nd of 1862, and listen to this description. This is Meade's description of how the war should be prosecuted in the East. I have always maintained that Richmond need not and should not be attacked at all. That the proper mode to reduce it is to take possession of the great lines of railroad leading to it from the south and the southwest. Cut these and stop the supplies going there, and their army will be compelled to evacuate it. And meet us on the ground we can select ourselves. The blind infatuation of the authorities at Washington will not permit that proper course to be adopted. And we shall have to take the consequences. What's Meade just described? What's he just described? You guys wake up.
Great plan.
Sorry?
Great plan.
The Overland Campaign, absolutely. This is November of 1862. Smart guy, smart guy. At Fredericksburg, the division will do well, and after Fredericksburg, Meade will now be placed in command of the 5th Corps. Who does he replace? Anybody know? Dan Butterfield, enemy number 2. Dan Butterfield. And Meade will again send a message he's received to his wife in a letter. It's from a staff teamster of the Pennsylvania Reserves, apparently entirely unsolicited. And that teamster will write to me, they all as a division loved you as a commander. That goes home to Margaret and gets saved by Meade. When Burnside finally resigns, apparently Meade is considered to replace Burnside and is favored by Stanton and Halleck over Hooker. We all know Hooker gets the command. Meade will write to his wife, January 26th of 1863, as to Hooker, you know my opinion of it, frequently expressed. I believe Hooker is a good soldier. The danger he runs is of subjecting himself to bad influences, such as Dan Butterfield and Dan Sickles, who being intellectually more clever than Hooker and leading him to believe they are very influential, will obtain an injurious ascendancy over him and insensibly affect his conduct. Meade is very astute at looking at what's going on around him and assessing both skill sets, as we'll see, and personalities. Okay. Meade, we know, will take command famously of the Union Army of the Potomac, June the 28th of 1863, There is a revolt among the senior commanders in the Army of the Potomac after Chancellorsville, and there are three senior commanders, major generals, senior to Meade, who will go to Meade and say, we don't want this, we're willing to say we'll work for you. And Meade says, well, okay, but I'm not getting in the middle of this, gonna stay away from politics within the Army. They write a letter and they're gonna start to lobby in Lincoln. Meade will have absolutely no part of that, doesn't wanna know what's going on, and is pretty out of it, right? And as we know, he will write to his wife at one point shortly before that famous June the 28th, I don't have any chance to be commander of the Army of the Potomac because I don't have any political friends in Washington. But then he goes on and says, I think your ambition is being roused and that you are beginning to be bitten by the dazzling prospect of having for a husband a commanding general of the Army. So a little bit of razzing going on there. He'll also indicate to her that he hasn't seen Hooker in 2 weeks. Hooker is one of those generals who keeps everything close to his vest and doesn't let anybody else know what's going on. So on June the 27th, when Meade arrives in Frederick, Maryland, that his march orders for the day, that's all he knows. Your job, George Meade, march to Frederick. He goes in search of Hooker. Hasn't seen him, goes to Hooker's headquarters. Hooker is not there. And we know Sickles isn't there yet, right? So he's not partying at Sickles' headquarters. He may be partying at someone else's headquarters. But that, of course, is the day that Hooker will send his resignation in to Washington. It will be accepted. Meade takes command. What are the reactions? The soldiers of the Army of the Potomac are enthusiastic because they think McClellan's coming back. When they realize Meade's in command, they change, they accept the change, but there's no great enthusiasm for it. But we've got some other people who will write about it. John Gibbon in the Second Corps writes to his wife, I'm delighted. I now feel my confidence restored, and I believe we shall whip these fellows. Alpheus Williams, 12th Corps, rejoiced at the change of commanders. Now with a gentleman and a soldier in command, I have renewed confidence that we shall at least do enough to preserve our honor and the safety of the Republic. John Nicolay, who was Lincoln's secretary, says George Meade is a good officer so far as he has been tried. But as we have had 6 different commanders fall in the back, fail in the task he assumes, it is idle to say whether or not he will make the 7th. So in Washington, by this time, everybody else has taken themselves out of the running for command of the Army of the Potomac. Meade is considered a safe choice, a non-political general, and somebody who doesn't enter into all of this stuff that goes on at the top of the Army of the Potomac. Well, we know he gets those orders from Washington to take command, protect Baltimore and Washington, get Lee out of Pennsylvania, and an extraordinary power in those orders. You may move around, dismiss any officer in the Army of the Potomac without regard to rank. And Meade will now create a couple more enemies as he exercises that power. So let's talk real quickly about what Meade's challenges are as he takes command. He's been a corps commander, but now he's got a whole new set of responsibilities. And he didn't know at the time, but we know he's 3 days away from a major battle. So now, first of all, no prior experience with independent command. We know how that works out in Longstreet when he goes west after Gettysburg, right? There's a big step up from a corps commander to now independent command. Longstreet doesn't do it well. That's one of those things that Meade now has to work his way through. New responsibilities, logistics. He hasn't had to worry much about that before, only where the 5th Corps trains are now. He's got to think about the entire Army. What about cavalry? He hasn't had to worry about that. Now he's got to worry about the cavalry. Location of the supply depot. That now falls under his, in his portfolio, communications. And he's gonna have some communication problems at Gettysburg, thanks to Jed Stewart. Artillery reserve, he's now gotta figure out what to do with this. And he's gotta worry about politics, because now he's the guy who reports to Henry Halleck in Washington and Abraham Lincoln in Washington. And we can't underestimate this, he has the responsibility for protecting the nation and Washington. No longer is he making recommendations and then following orders. You've got to devise the winning strategy. He's responsible now for the entire battlefield, not just his portion of it. And he's now delegating responsibilities, people that he can't watch fulfill those responsibilities. Very different set of requirements here. He also has to instill confidence in the leadership of the Army of the Potomac. If there's anything George Meade is not, he is not a rah-rah guy. No charisma. You've heard the descriptions, cold. No charisma, no feeling in this guy. He's got to figure out how to do that. And he's got this dramatically expanded portfolio. Now he's got some experience. He's been in the high command of the, and in charge of the 5th Corps. He knows who's around him. He's been to other councils of war, so he's been in positions where he can evaluate the other commanders. And he knows what it's like to be kept in the dark and not getting the full picture of what the Army's doing. Meade will do the precise opposite of what Joseph Hooker is doing. So he's got some experience to help him. He also has some advantages. He has an extraordinary staff at Gettysburg. Gouverneur Warren, the chief engineer, Henry Hunt, the chief of artillery, Jonathan Letterman in charge of medical, Colonel George Sharp in charge of intelligence. These are extraordinary officers that will assist Meade in all sorts of different ways. But he also has some challenges, right? What are Meade's challenges as he takes command of the Army?
We're not counting sickles.
We've talked about that.
We're not counting sickles.
He's got to worry about sickles, right? And we'll talk a little bit about that. But he's already had some dealings with sickles. All right, so he's not new to the issue. What else?
Butterfield.
Butterfield. He inherits a staff that he doesn't choose. Okay, that's not an easy thing to do. So he's inheriting a staff, and he knows that his chief of staff, and he's going to try and replace Butterfield, but nobody else that he asked is willing to take the job in the situation that they're in. So maybe he's going to be stuck with Butterfield, and we'll see how he kind of works his way around Butterfield when he needs to. Many of the orders that are issued, from Meade's headquarters don't come from Dan Butterfield. They come from Seth Williams, who's the adjutant. Meade and Seth Williams have a great relationship. So he's going to go around Butterfield, but there are a couple of things that he will ask Butterfield to do that will cause him problems later. All right, so 2 very good examples of this kind of collaborative leadership that George Meade adopts as he takes command of the Army of the Potomac. The first is, and I'm sure you're all familiar with, the Pipe Creek Circular. Okay, he issues that circular the morning of July the 1st. He's not very happy. It takes his staff a while to get it out, which is why John Reynolds, furthest away, never gets it. But when you look at that circular, it includes orders for every corps, every part of the Army, so they all know what each other are doing. And it's not only a march order for the next day, but it's, here's the situation. And there may be contingencies, there may be reasons that we have to change this. He's alerting his corps commanders to be on their toes, because things may change rapidly. Very, very clear, George Meade does that. The other thing George Meade does is issue a circular to his corps commanders about communicating with the rest of the Army of the Potomac. Okay, and this is kind of the one piece of inspirational stuff that George Meade does. Everything else is absolutely cold, crisp, clear, concise. This is different. So this goes out a couple of days before the battle, June, I don't remember the exact date, it might be June 29th. And this is what he tells his senior commanders to do. Meade requests that before the engagement soon expected with the enemy, all commanding officers address their troops, explaining to them briefly the immense issues involved in the struggle. The enemy are on our soil. The whole country now looks anxiously to this army to deliver it from the presence of the foe. Homes, firesides, and domestic altars are involved. The army has fought well before. It is believed that it will fight more desperately and bravely than ever if it is addressed in fitting terms. New paragraph. Commanders are authorized to order the instant death of any soldier who fails to do his duty at this hour. Okay, it's a remarkable piece of correspondence, and we know because he's pushing all the buttons these soldiers need to have pushed. He's talking about their homes, their firesides. How many Pennsylvania soldiers are in George Meade's Army of the Potomac? Close to 35,000 out of 92,000. Okay, a full third of his army. This is personal now to them, and he's going to make sure they remember that and realize it. He also compliments the army. You fought well before, I expect you're going to do it again. Classic, perfect leadership. So Meade is going to push all of those buttons, and we know that his commanding officers filter that down through the army because we have after action reports that say before we went into battle, our commanding officer addressed us to understand the import of what we're doing. Okay, and that's coming directly from George Meade. There is no similar order from Robert E. Lee, and I would suggest to you that most of Robert E. Lee's soldiers don't know why they're in Pennsylvania. Just ask Richard Ewell sitting on Oak Hill why he leaves that hill. Instead of reporting back to Robert E. Lee, I'm sitting on high ground. What do you think? I don't think Richard Ewell even knows he's supposed to be looking for high ground. Okay, so very, very different approach. There are disruptions in the communications Meade has with Washington. Jeff Stewart has done his job. He's torn down the telegraph lines between Gettysburg and Frederick and Gettysburg and Relay, Maryland. To get a message to Washington, George Meade sets up the Pony Express. Every 7 miles, a fresh horse and a fresh messenger. It takes hours to get any kind of communication to Washington. And what does that mean for George Meade? Not much coming back. Now that may be the best thing that happened to George Meade here. Because as we'll see during the retreats, if we get there, there are going to be a lot of mixed messages that come from Washington once those telegraph lines are restored. All right, so I want to spend some time. There's his sister, there's his, and then I keep pushing the wrong button, there's his wife. All right, so let's talk about what George Meade knows. Because it's going to die here shortly. All right, so George Meade will be a very, very active commander. He's been a corps commander just 3 days before, and maybe he's having a little trouble letting go of that, but there are some very good reasons for what he's doing. So on July the 1st, where's Meade? Town, right? Headquarters, right in the middle of the Pipe Creek Circular. He's got Butterfield with him. He's got his staff with him at Town. And George Meade is surprised when he starts to get messages back from Gettysburg. We got a message from Buford. Confederates are pushing on into Gettysburg. Buford's job up there, scatter. Now Buford's going to start to defend that town, or at least try and keep the Confederates away from the center of the road system. By mid-morning, he'll get that message. Now we know the Confederates start in by 7:30 in the morning, right? When does Meade get the message? Mid-morning. delay. Okay. 11:30, he gets the message, he gets Reynolds' message from Gettysburg that had to be sent 10 o'clock-ish, give or take. So it takes time, and then by 1 o'clock in the afternoon, after he's met with Hancock on a download of the situation with Hancock, he receives the message that Reynolds is dead. By 1:30, Hancock's on his way to Gettysburg. Okay, and remember, Hancock is not the senior commander. All right, and you can imagine the discussion that Meade and Hancock had. Meade can't leave headquarters. There's a reason he stays at Ponytown. He can't leave. His army needs to know where he is. But he delegates to Hancock, and you can imagine that Meade says, Hancock, I'm sending you to Gettysburg, and Hancock says, yeah, but I'm not senior enough. So what does Meade do? He writes him a note. And Hancock goes up to Gettysburg with that note in his pocket from Dad that says, Hancock's in command on the battlefield. Meade has assessed the ability of both Howard and Doubleday and is not excited by what he has up here. He trusted Reynolds to be close to Lee. Doesn't quite trust those guys. So he's going to send Hancock up, who Meade trusts, Meade knows, and fortunately happens to be there and at Ponytown. So Hancock, of course, arrives 4 o'clock-ish in the afternoon. He'll do his job. He'll help secure Cemetery Hill, take a look at the ground. By about 5:30, he's got a message that's on its way back to me, telling him really good ground here, and I think we can hold out overnight. But at 6 o'clock, before Hancock's message gets there to Ponytown, he gets a message from Buford. And that's the famous message that says, there's nobody here in charge. And there's a lot of dispute whether Meade gets the message from Hancock before he orders the troops, the rest of the Union Army, up to Gettysburg. My guess is that's triggered by Buford's message. There's nobody up here who's in charge. Okay, so Hancock's up there by 7 o'clock. Meade has issued orders for the Army of the Potomac to march to Gettysburg. By 10 o'clock at night, Meade closes down headquarters and starts his trek up to Gettysburg among all the rest of the marching troops. It takes time. He'll arrive around midnight, but he does another interesting thing. He leaves the headquarters in Ponytown open. In case any messages come into Ponytown, they can be referred back up to Gettysburg. Who does he leave at Ponytown? Butterfield. He'll take Seth Williams with him. He leaves Butterfield behind. Okay, that's not the last time he will make that kind of choice, knowing not only who works well for him, but who he works well with. All right, so let's talk about July the 2nd. Where is George Meade? Well, he arrives around midnight, and he will talk to the officers there. Right? At the gatehouse, who's he talk to? Who's there? Howard's there. Doubleday's there.
Hunt,
Hunt, I think, goes up with Meade. So Hunt's there. Who else? Dan Sickles. Sickles is already there. Okay. So Sickles is there. He'll talk to them. And then 4-ish in the morning, he's going to ride Cemetery Ridge. He'll get a little bit of help with the road system from Elizabeth Thorne, who's the caretaker of the wife of the caretaker of the cemetery. Headquarters at that point is in the gatehouse at the cemetery. She'll point out the roads in the moonlight. And then he rides all the way down Cemetery Ridge to a little round top, back around again, close to Culp's Hill, back up, and we know, of course, what happens on that road. He has an engineer on his staff drawing a topographical map. Cemetery Ridge, Culp's Hill, Cemetery Hill in the north, the round tops in the south. And Meade takes that map, marks on it where he wants the arriving troops to position themselves. That's Meade's famous fish hook. And then his staff makes a copy of that map. And as every senior commander arrives, they get a copy of the map. What does that map tell them? It tells them where they're to put their troops, right? What else does it tell them? Where everybody else is. Okay, so now every senior commander in the Army of the Potomac will have that map. And by the way, Dan Sickles seems to be the only one who can't move. But we'll talk about that in a second. And I'm gonna try and move along. So Meade, and again, Meade probably hasn't slept in the last 48 hours, close to the last 72 hours. He'll be up still at 6 a.m. in the morning. That's when Hancock's troops come in. He'll meet with them and he will personally help position them on Cemetery Ridge. Note that Meade does not place Sickles' troops who are already at Gettysburg to protect that left flank of Cemetery Hill. He leaves them down in the valley, as far away from Cemetery Hill as he can get them, and still have them on the battlefield. Right? And if you're lucky, you might use those troops to leave Sickles down in the valley. So he's not specifically not going to move Sickles men into position. He could do that, but he doesn't. He waits for Hancock to get there, and Hancock's troops. So he'll meet them at 6 in the morning. By 7 o'clock, he's riding to Culp's Hill with Howard and Warren. They're going to go all the way down the Baltimore Pike, all the way up to Culp's Hill. What's he looking for? Potential attack. And they'll look at the ground and say, bad idea. So Meade is now convinced by 7 in the morning that there will be no Union attack at Gettysburg on July the 2nd. They're going to sit in that nice high ground, blocking Lee from the roads that lead to Baltimore and Washington, and wait to see what Lee does. All right, so let's talk about during the day of July, what Lee doing. 9 o'clock or so, and again, ish at the end of all of these times, headquarters is established at the Leicester House. Lydia Leicester has left. She's abandoned her home and it's in the perfect position right in the middle of the fishhook. So the Leicester House is established and we begin a colloquy with Sickles by 9 o'clock in the morning. They will go back and forth. First, Meade will send his son, Georgie, we'll call him Georgie, down to Sickles' headquarters to see if Sickles is getting his men in position. Sickles is sleeping, not to be disturbed. He was up all night. So Georgie rides back and says, so Dad, Sickles is sleeping, there's no movement down there. And we know Sickles, or we know Meade kind of explodes and says, go back down, tell Sickles to get his act together. So Georgie rides back. And we're talking about a couple of 3 miles from the headquarters down to Sickles' headquarters. And then Sickles will start with this back and forth of, so I know where you want my right flank. You want me to extend Hancock's line. Where do you want my left flank? What is it? And they're going to go back and forth. And eventually, and this will happen several times, Sickles, by about 11 o'clock in the morning, will go to Meade's headquarters. And Meade is going to come out on the porch of that house and point to Little Round Top for Sickles and say, see the hill? Put your guys on the hill. That's where I want your left flank. And what does Sickles say? Well, you know, there's some really nice high ground up here. You think that would be okay. And can I make some decisions about where these troops go? And maybe just kind of gives up and says, anywhere within the scope of my orders, you may put your troops. So is the peach orchard in the scope of Meade's orders?
No.
Probably not. Okay, you've given the lawyer an inch, he's taken a mile. Imagine that. Okay, so and Meade doesn't know that. Sickles rides off, and again, no particular stealth move by Sickles. The drums are beating, the bugles are playing, the flags are up, and we've got a full dress parade from Cemetery Ridge up to the Emmitsburg Road. And then, of course, reaching back toward Little Round Top, but he leaves Little Round Top undefended. Meade doesn't know, doesn't bother to tell me, so I think my position is going to be this. It's not until 3 o'clock in the afternoon that George Meade sends Governor Warren out, his chief engineer, to check the lines, make sure everybody's where they're supposed to be. And Warren finds out the problem. Comes back and tells George Meade, so by the way, Sickles is not where he's supposed to be. In the meantime, Meade has now, and also, I skipped this, Meade is preparing for any eventuality like any good commander would. Meade will direct his corps commanders first to become familiar with the roads around them. And then eventually, later in the morning, maybe early afternoon, Meade sends an order to all of his corps commanders telling them they are to draw the position of their troops and their trains so that Meade knows exactly where everybody is. So he's kind of preparing for any eventuality, including an eventuality that they may be defeated at Gettysburg and have to retreat back, still protecting Baltimore and Washington, but retreating down the Taneytown Road and the Baltimore Pike. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Meade, who has expected an attack all day long, he and Jubal Early seem to be the only ones who are expecting an attack on the morning of July the 2nd. He will now call his corps commanders to his headquarters. Think about this. We're now 4 days in, right? 5 days in. 5 days in on July the 2nd. He has not yet met with all of his corps commanders together. And he's already lost Reynolds and replaced Doubleday. Okay, so he's got some stuff going on here. He's going to call them to headquarters, and that's when he finds him. So he rides out to the peach orchard. And this is the next slide is the one I really want you to pay attention to, because for the most part, we kind of know this stuff. What we typically don't know is what George Meade does for the next 5 hours. So let's look at it. Actually, and this is his headquarters, Lydia Leicester House. Here we go. And this is a photograph, today's photograph. This is taken on the northern, just on the northern slope of Little Round Top. Right, there's a, yeah, right here is where Munchauer Hill is. Okay, so right here is the Wheatfield Road. We're looking at House Ridge, and Little Round Top's over here. Okay, George Meade will create a temporary headquarters. After he goes out and reads Sickles' Riot Act, he realizes there's no time to protect. There's no time for Sickles to come back to Cemetery Ridge. And so all he can do is reinforce. Now he's got a choice, right? He could leave Sickles hanging out there, or he could reinforce him. He makes the choice to reinforce him, and he'll create that temporary headquarters. So now he's left headquarters, but he's got somebody from every corps with him to send messages if he needs to, or part of his staff. And he will now be absolutely involved in the positioning of almost every set of troops on the battlefield. We know that the Union defense begins 4 o'clock in the afternoon on July the 2nd with about 10,000 soldiers, Sickles, 3rd Corps. Throughout the next 3 hours, and actually even more, Meade will reposition as many as 22,000 troops, and much of it personally. Okay, so he'll be down at that intersection by the north slope of Little Round Top and Wheatfield Road, establishing that headquarters, and he will first direct the 5th Corps in to the Wheatfield. And we know part of that gets diverted up to Little Round Top by 6 o'clock. So the fighting's going on, and he's got a vision of that headquarters into part of the Wheatfield part of the slaughter pen, part of Plum Run. No visibility in the Little Round Top, no visibility forward to the Peach Orchard and Cemetery Ridge. So now by 6 o'clock, in the midst of all that fighting, he's gonna ride up Cemetery Ridge. He needs to see what's going on up there. And while he's up on Cemetery Ridge, he's gonna start to move more troops away. He'll order the 12th Corps, or as much of the 12th Corps as they can do without. He'll order them over and he greets them as they arrive, or at least as part of them arrive on the battlefield, and puts them in position. He greets Willard's brigade as they come down from Cemetery Hill and into that center of the Union battle line. He's doing all of this stuff. And at that point, he's got visibility to the Peach Orchard and the Emmitsburg Road, and then he's gonna ride back down to those temporary headquarters. And when they're needed, he will personally lead the Pennsylvania reserves into Plum Run and up into the wheat field. So it's very, very active, and you can kind of imagine a chart taking the Pennsylvania reserves into battle. Those are his guys. So that's his headquarters. By 7 o'clock, he's still on Cemetery Ridge, so a lot of the fighting in the Peach Orchard, the wheat field, Devil's Den, Little Round Top is over by now. He's at Cemetery Ridge, and now he's sending troops over to East Cemetery Hill. So again, very actively doing that. He'll ride all the way over to McKnight's Hill, which is where the Slocum Monument is, Stevens Knoll on the battlefield between Colt Hill and Cemetery Hill. He'll be over there. It's not until 8 o'clock in the evening, 5 hours later, that George Meade returns to the Life Grounds. Okay. He'll return there, and the first thing he does is dictate a telegram to Washington that says, heavy fighting today. We're going to stay here at Gettysburg. Whether we're on offense or defense tomorrow, haven't figured out. Okay, so think about that when we talk about quickly the Council of War. Now I'm finished. So he returns to the Leicester House. We have the Council of War. This was done in 1879. If George Meade did not stand during most of the Council of War, most recollections indicate he sat at the table. And very interesting leadership that George Meade does here. This is now the first time that he meets with all of his commanders in one place, and they meet each other. And Reynolds is gone, Sickles is gone, oh well. And probably happy about that, right? Hancock is in charge of both second and third at this point, but Gibbon's there, who thinks he's in charge of the second corps, but he's not really sure. But Meade says, no, go ahead and stay, and it's Gibbon who will write the notes of this Council of War. And they're not found. So all the testimony that happens in 1864 in front of the Committee on the Conduct of the War, it's all by memory, all of it. They don't find the notes of this Council of War until after Meade dies. They're in Meade's papers. So that's where they come from. So Meade will do this Council of War, and he's sitting at the desk. His officers start to come in. He sits there. He's not talking to anybody. He's getting information, but he's listening as his officers are talking to each other. He's gauging morale, and he's gauging their willingness to continue to fight and the effectiveness of their troops. How enthusiastic are they about this? Not saying a word. And they begin to talk to each other. And eventually, the first question George Meade has asked is, how many effectives do you have? And each corps commander will report the number of effectives they still have. The number's about 58,000 by the end of day 2. And then, he'll be getting other information from George Sharp out of the Bureau of Military Information. George Meade, and then Dan Butterfield is the guy that after Newton makes a comment about the way this is a lousy place for a battle. Butterfield, and there starts a little bit of an argument. Butterfield will say, tell you what, why don't we ask some questions? And Meade's like, okay, fine. So first question, what is it? Do we leave or do we stay? But wait a minute, Meade's already made that decision. What's he looking for? Buy-in. He wants buy-in. He wants these guys all on the same page. He's already had a problem with Sickles, who doesn't seem to understand his orders. Now he wants to make sure that everybody buys into what's going on. So that's the first question. Do we stay or do we leave? They all agree to stay. And of course, they answer in reverse order of seniority. Okay, and then second question. If we stay, are we on offense or defense? And they all decide defense. We got great position. Lee's got to attack us. So we'll stay. And we'll be on defense. Third question. Yeah, if we stay and we're on defense, how long do we wait? And the answer is 24 hours. They all know the math, a lot of this is mathematical formula. Lee's gonna eat his way out of the area in 3 days. So he's got 1 day left. And they have every expectation, Lee aggressive will fight. So that's the, and all Meade says is, such then is the decision. That's it. But now everybody knows what the plan is. And they all go back where they came from. Okay. So we're gonna stop there because I know it's getting late. And I apologize for not getting, I knew I had too much stuff. But hopefully it's all interesting stuff. Meade will, when we look at a couple of things, criticism in particular, criticism of Meade for failing to follow Lee more immediately. He will ride down at the end of Pickett's charge. He'll ride down the little round top and send reconnaissance out. And they get shot at by Confederates. So they come back, it's late in the day. At that point, Meade says, okay, we're done. July 4th, Lee, we know that evening, starts to retreat. Meade doesn't know it's a retreat. And Meade's army is hungry. Their food's 25 miles away. So Meade's gonna take time to defeat his army while he continues to look. There's a lot of criticism of Meade for failing to be more aggressive against Lee. He's got some real problems, both in the number of effective soldiers. At one point during the retreat, he writes to his wife and says, oh, for corps commanders, because he's now without Hancock too. And he doesn't have an aggressive corps commander. Just to finish, 2 quotes to finish this up. One is, Meade will write a letter to his wife, July 8th, and he'll tell her that in the last 10 days since he took command, he hasn't had a regular meal, not a night's sleep, hasn't washed his hands, hasn't washed his face many days, hasn't changed his clothes in June and July. And feels as though the weight of the country is on his shoulders. He'll tell her, I think I've lived 30 years in the last 10 days because of the stress. And then the last quote I'll give you, after all of this assessment, I'm happy to talk about any of this in questions. Let me just read you this final assessment of George Meade by Henry Hunt, and this is published in 1888. This is Henry Hunt's assessment after thinking about what George Meade did for 25 years. Meade was right in his orders as to Pipe Creek, right in pushing up to Gettysburg after the battle commenced, right in remaining there, right in making his battle a purely defensive one. Right, therefore, in taking the line he did, right in not attempting a counterattack at any stage of the battle, right as to his pursuit of Lee. Rarely has more skill, vigor, or wisdom been shown in any such circumstances. That's a pretty amazing assessment by Henry Hunt, who is much like E.P. Alexander, very astute at evaluating things that happen. So we'll end there. Again, I'm happy to take any questions. I know somebody wanted to talk about Sickles, but I also know it's late.
Yeah, question.
So whatever you'd like to do. Yes.
Obviously, Meade's wife's letters that, the letters that survived.
Yes,
Okay.
yeah,
Where are they?
they're at the Philadelphia Historical Society.
Thank-
Okay, so his letters have survived. Whatever his wife wrote, we don't know. Because they didn't survive. We were talking about that at dinner. We assumed that when Meade got them, he read them and destroyed them. Okay? Yes,
He wanted to fight a defensive war because his background is a topographic engineer and surveyor, right? 'Cause he-
yeah, I don't know that one follows the other.
He knows features of the land and maps, so he has an advantage over everybody.
Well, remember, all of these West Pointers are engineers. Lee's an engineer. There is no excuse for the way Lee handled Gettysburg. He ought to be able to look at the ground and make the same assessment George Meade is making. So all these guys are engineers. Humphreys is an engineer. A lot of them are. The volunteers are not. But all these West Point guys, their curriculum is engineering. So they're all engineers. Yeah. But he's a bright guy. Yeah.
Eric, what do you make of the inscription on Meade's tombstone? He did his duty and is at rest.
You know, that's George Meade. He's humble. And it wouldn't surprise me. I don't remember if I've read that he wrote that to go on his tombstone. It would not surprise me if he wrote that to be on his tombstone. A very, very humble guy. And can I get back to my slide presentation? I just want, if you go to Washington, who's seen the Meade statue in Washington, DC? Yeah?
Right in front of the courthouse.
Yeah, it's in front of the courthouse now. Can I?
Yeah, just. You want to get to a statue?
Yeah. There we go. Okay. So this is the monument that's put up in Washington, DC. Fortunately, and a lot of these photographs are just, or paintings give you a sense of where Meade is placed among the constellation of generals during, after the Civil War. In some cases, he's very close to Grant, who's always in the middle, by the way. But in other cases, kind of off on the periphery as his reputation comes and goes. And if anybody's got one of these at home, let me know. $1,000 currency to George Meade. This is his statue in Washington, DC. I'm convinced that if George Meade ever saw that, he'd be horrible. Absolutely horrified. It's allegorical. There are naked women on it. They're pulling his clothes off. It's just way over the top. But if you get a chance, go take a look at it and just prepare to be shocked. So that's the only one I'm going to make about that. It's just a statue. Other questions?
Did he ever testify in front of a committee in the Congress?
Yes. The Gettysburg Chancellorsville hearings begin in February of 1864. Testifying first, Dan Sickles. Second, Abner Doubleday. Third, Albion Hack. All are enemies of George Meade by this. Okay, Meade is reorganized how out of the army. We know what happens to Doubleday. He never forgives Meade. And we know about Sickles, right? And then Meade comes to town on business. He doesn't know anything about this. So he comes to town on business. He's in the process of reorganizing the Army of the Potomac. And he's up there to meet with Haddock. Big business immediately pre-Grant. So he goes up to talk to Halleck, and Stanton comes and says, you know, there's this thing going on. And he starts to hear about it, and he will go testify the next day. And Ben Wade, who's in charge of the committee, will say, we're just taking a little history about the Battle of Gettysburg. Just come and talk to us, no big deal. And so Meade goes and testifies. He has no counsel. He has no right to cross-examine anybody. Nobody else is there. There was one person there to take his testimony, Ben Wade, who's a radical Republican and wants Meade removed. And Meade has no access to his papers. And he testifies for 5 hours. and it's incredibly accurate. And then once he starts to realize what's going on, that Sickles has introduced part of the Pipe Creek Circular to say this is a retreat order. Meade goes back, gets his papers, comes back and testifies 2 more times. But the report from those hearings isn't issued until after the war is over in 1865. It all kind of comes to an end when Grant comes to peace. They realize then they're never going to get Meade, which is what they want. Because they want Hooker back in charge. Sickles wants Hooker back in charge. Any other questions? Yeah.
Talked about me not following the Confederates when they retreated. Didn't they leave some fires up in their areas, tool? I think they were still there.
It's not at all clear when Lee started to move out, whether he's retreating or repositioning. And Meade's got to know that. Because if Meade gives up that ground too soon, then he didn't win. So you can't give it up too fast. And they'll pull away the troops first from part of Seminary Ridge, but they're leaving. I think it's Aiken Hill that gets left behind as they retreat. So just like when they leave Fredericksburg on their way up here, they're going to mask that movement. They're going to do the same thing when they retreat from Gettysburg. It's going to take Meade 3 to 4 days, legitimately, to feed his army, supply his army, and figure out what he's doing. And that's 4 days while Meade's moving. But remember, it's raining 3.5 inches a day. So he's not moving real fast, but he's moving faster than Meade is. Yeah. Meade's going to continue to look and figure out. But who does he send out after Lee? He sends Sykes. And the 5th Corps at Sykes is not very aggressive. So when Sykes gets shot at a couple of times, they go, ooh, we're out of here. And so you don't get a quick movement, but there's some reasons for it. Yeah. Okay, other questions? Yeah, sorry.
Why was he not president of Appomattox?
Why? Why was he not president at Appomattox? He's not there because he is ill.
Oh, he's ill.
Yeah, and he's about 5-7 miles away. So it's not possible to get him information there. On the day after the surrender, April 10th, he will get permission to go through the lines and go meet with Lee. Because they know each other. And they have a little conversation.
He was running the army too. I mean, duh.
Well, he's working, but he's also pretty ill. I mean, there are lots of times Meade is going to have these bouts with pneumonia, and a lot of it from that 1862 wound. But that's why it was no intention of Grant's ever to exclude Meade. And Meade is the one, it's his officers who are the ones sending the messages back and forth. But the last message goes directly to Grant instead of to Meade. So there's no intention at all to exclude Meade. Just happens. But it's significant, right? Because everybody goes, well, where's Meade? Yeah, exactly. Okay. Okay. I know Tom's ready. There's a football game on. I know. Yeah. What's Grant's opinion of Meade? Probably the best indication of that are 2 things. One is when Grant is first placed in command as general in chief, he will come meet with Meade at headquarters, and everybody thinks he's going to replace Meade. And he's got Baldy Smith with him. And everybody thinks Baldy Smith is going to be the new commanding general of the Army of the Potomac. Grant meets with Meade for a long time, walks out and says, this guy's great, essentially. I'm not going to replace him. And Meade's going to offer his resignation. Meade offers his resignation probably 6 times between the end of the battle here and when Grant takes is general in chief. The other thing Grant does that doesn't get a lot of press is that Grant never issues an order directly to any corps commander in the Army of the Potomac. They all go through Meade. And Meade is a very important part of all of the strategy that goes on. Okay, yeah, good questions.
Well,
I'm gonna let you go.
no, no,
Mark.
no, no.
Oh, no.
Thank you very
I
much.
don't know who's gonna fight it.
Thank you very much.
Let's give Barry tonight.